In 1912, the town of Villisca, Iowa, existed as a quiet island.
It was a place where neighbors left their front doors unlatched and children played in the streets until the sun dipped behind the horizon.
The air here felt different, detached from the violence that gripped the wider world. Residents moved through their days without a second thought for security. They walked home under the evening sky, trusting the shadows they passed. Every house on every block stood as a symbol of domestic stability.
The town was a sanctuary built on faith and familiarity. Neighbors shared meals,
Borrowed tools, and slept with windows cracked open to catch the summer breeze. There were no alarms, no heavy bolts, and no reason to fear the dark. It was a community that believed in its own permanence.
But the stillness of that June evening carried a weight no one noticed. The town was fragile, held together by the simple assumption that the world outside would never cross their threshold.
As the light faded, the town prepared for another night of unbroken rest.
Unaware that the boundary between their safety and a nightmare was already beginning to thin.
The evening of June 9 found the Moore household walking up the path. Josiah Moore led the way, with his family and two young guests trailing close behind. They had spent the day at church, returning to the house that served as the center of their lives. The front door swung open, and they crossed the threshold, the wood groaning slightly under their weight. They moved through the rooms with the ease of habit, setting down belongings and preparing for the night. No one looked back at the street. No one noticed the silence of the yard. Inside, the house was a vessel of warmth. They moved from the parlor to the kitchen, the floorboards responding to every step. One by one, the lamps were extinguished. The light retreated, corner by corner, until the entire structure settled into a heavy, absolute darkness.
They climbed the stairs, the sound of their movement echoing briefly before dying out.
They locked the doors and pulled the shades. They believed the walls were a barrier against the world. They had no way of knowing that they were simply closing the trap from the inside.
The house groaned under the settling of the night, but this sound was different. It came from the porch.
A slow, rhythmic pressure tested the wood, finding the soft spot near the frame.
The door did not need to be forced. It simply yielded. An intruder stepped across the threshold.
The floorboards barely protesting under a calculated, steady weight. The air inside was stagnant and heavy with the scent of summer sleep. The intruder moved with purpose, avoiding the center of the rooms where the floor might flex.
In the dark, a heavy axe head brushed against a wooden doorframe, a dull,
metallic scrape that died instantly in the stillness. Room by room, the intruder navigated the layout, mapping the location of every bed by the sound of rhythmic breathing. There was no hesitation.
The intruder reached the first landing and paused, listening to the silence of the house.
A child shifted in a nearby room, a soft sigh that broke the tension, and the intruder turned toward the sound.
The axe was raised, the balance point gripped tight, and the first blow fell.
The town's innocence shattered in that single, muffled impact, and the long, dark work of the night began in earnest. Morning light hit the white siding of the house with a deceptive, golden clarity. The town moved in its usual rhythm, but the Moore house remained a closed, silent box. By mid-morning, the neighbors grew uneasy. No smoke rose from the chimney. No movement stirred behind the curtains. They gathered on the porch,
their voices muted, hesitating before they finally pushed the front door open. It swung inward without a sound. They stepped into the hallway, and the air hit them first a thick,
metallic tang that clung to the back of the throat. It tasted of iron and something long dead. One neighbor walked toward the staircase, his boots clicking hard against the floorboards. He reached the master bedroom and stopped. The door was slightly ajar. He pushed it, and the scene inside locked his breath in his lungs. The beds were not occupied by sleepers. The sheets were dark, soaked through, and the air in the room was heavy with the unmistakable weight of a slaughter. They did not speak. They did not scream. They simply stood in the doorway, staring at the carnage. As the reality of the night before settled into the wood and the wallpaper, the house had held its silence for hours, and now it was finally speaking in blood. The investigators moved through the rooms with a growing sense of confusion. In the master bedroom,
every mirror was draped in heavy cloth, wiped clean of any reflection. The windows, usually open to the morning breeze, were sealed tight behind thick, darkened curtains that blocked every sliver of sunlight.
The house was a tomb, intentionally disconnected from the outside world. They stepped into the kitchen, and the floor held a different kind of evidence. A plate of food sat on the table, untouched,
the contents hardening in the still air. Beside it, on the floorboards, a bowl of water sat in the center of the room. It was not clear water. It was clouded with streaks of dark red, the surface still and stagnant.
They knelt to inspect the bowl, their movements slow and deliberate. There was no sign of a struggle in this specific corner of the house, only a cold, calculated arrangement.
The presence of the bowl and the covered glass suggested an intruder who had not merely arrived to kill, but to stay.
They stood up, the silence of the house feeling heavier than before, as they realized the killer had lingered long after the violence had ended, performing tasks that had no place in a common crime. The news moved through Villisca faster than the authorities. Within the hour, the front gate was no longer a barrier. It was a threshold for a growing, restless crowd. They did not wait for the sheriff. They did not wait for a perimeter. They surged up the walkway, boots crushing the grass into the dirt. The house, once a private space of horror, became a public spectacle. People pushed past the initial responders, their curiosity overriding the gravity of the scene. They stepped into the bedrooms, their heavy tread grinding wood splinters into the floorboards. Hands reached out to touch the bed frames, the walls, and the furniture, smearing away fingerprints that might have told a story. They walked over the very spots where the intruder had stood, their presence erasing the patterns in the dust and the blood. The bowl on the kitchen floor was kicked aside, the red water sloshing over the boards and seeping into the grain. Every footprint overlapped another, a chaotic map of movement that obliterated the truth. By the time the officials arrived to secure the premises, the crime scene had been turned into a thoroughfare. The chance to reconstruct the intruder's path vanished under the weight of hundreds of heels. The evidence was not merely lost, it was trampled into the foundation, ensuring that the mystery would remain as tangled as the footprints on the floor. With the physical trail destroyed, the town turned its gaze inward. If the clues were gone,
the motives had to be found in the living. Whisper campaigns began on street corners and in the hushed aisles of the local market.
Suspicion gravitated toward Frank Jones, a prominent businessman who had held a bitter, public grudge against Josiah Moore. They had been rivals in trade and status, their disputes a known fixture of town gossip for years. Men gathered at the general store, voices dropping when Jones walked past. The accusation was not stated in court, but it was spoken in every doorway. Families who had shared dinners for a decade stopped speaking. The community fractured,
with lines drawn between those who defended the businessman and those who saw the hand of a vengeful rival in the carnage. Every gesture from Jones was now parsed for guilt.
Every silence from his supporters interpreted as complicity. The atmosphere in Villisca hardened from collective grief into a sharp, jagged paranoia. Neighbors watched neighbors through half-drawn curtains, looking for signs of a hidden dark side. The search for a killer became a search for an enemy among them, and the town began to tear itself apart before the investigation had even truly begun. The focus on local rivalries shattered when the telegrams arrived from neighboring states. Investigators began to piece together a map, connecting the dots of blood across the Midwest.
One name surfaced repeatedly in the reports: William Mansfield. He was a drifter, a man who moved through the shadows of rail yards and slept in the hollows of transient camps.
His record was a trail of violence,
marked by the same signature of an axe and the same cold precision seen in the Moore house. The realization rippled through the town like a tremor. This was not a local grudge. It was the work of a phantom. The fear in Villisca transformed.
It was no longer about the man next door. It was about the stranger on the road.
The shadow at the edge of the property line. Authorities scrambled to track his movements, tracing his presence near other towns where similar families had been silenced in their sleep. The prospect of a serial predator operating in their midst paralyzed the community. Doors were barricaded with heavy timber.
Men took shifts, guarding their homes with shotguns resting on their laps. The hunt had moved beyond the town limits, casting a long, dark net across the entire region, searching for a killer who left no footprints and offered no mercy.
Just as the hunt for the drifter reached its peak, the investigation veered into the realm of the irrational.
Reverend George Kelly, a man known for his quiet presence in the community,
Suddenly broke under the pressure of the ongoing inquiry. In a room thick with the heat of a summer afternoon, he began to speak in a feverish, disconnected stream. His words were a torrent of graphic detail.
a confession that seemed to pull the truth directly from the nightmare of the crime scene. He described the movement through the rooms,
The weight of the weapon and the silence of the victims with a terrifying, intimate clarity.
Investigators scribbled furiously, believing they had finally pinned the shadow to the wall, but the clarity was a mirage.
As the fever broke, so did the narrative. Kelly retracted every syllable, claiming his confession was nothing more than the product of a broken mind and a restless, delirious sleep. The admission vanished as quickly as it had been uttered, leaving the authorities with nothing but a void. The case did not move forward. It disintegrated.
The town watched in disbelief as the primary suspect walked away from his own words.
Effectively burying the lead once more and plunging the entire investigation into total, irrecoverable chaos. The courtroom became a theater of frustration. Every attempt to prosecute a suspect hit a wall of hearsay,
Retracted statements, and missing physical proof. The prosecution presented their case with desperate intensity.
pointing to circumstantial links and local grudges, but the defense dismantled every claim with ease.
The gap between suspicion and certainty remained unbridgeable. Day after day,
The jury sat through hours of testimony that led nowhere, circling the same dark questions without ever landing on a definitive answer.
when the final deliberation concluded, the result was not justice, but a hollow silence.
The judge declared a stalemate. No one was held accountable. The gavel fell, not to finalize a verdict,
But to seal the mystery shut, the townspeople left the courthouse with the weight of the tragedy still pressing against their chests. The legal process had exhausted itself, failing to provide the closure the community desperately craved. Villisca fell into a state of permanent, suffocating dread.
The law had stepped back, leaving the empty house to loom over the streets.
Its secrets unpunished, and its history forever stained by the realization that the killer had simply ceased to be a target of the state.
The gavel had silenced the courtroom, but it did not quiet the town. In the weeks following the stalemate, the reality of the situation took root. The killer was not just free, the trail had gone entirely cold. There were no more leads to follow, no new suspects to interrogate, and no hope of a future breakthrough. The investigation had reached its absolute terminal point. Neighbors stopped looking at the road, fearing who might be walking back toward them. Trust, once the foundation of daily life, fractured into suspicion. People started locking doors that had never seen a bolt. The house itself became a monument to the failure of justice, a physical reminder that someone had committed the unthinkable and walked away without consequence. Over the months, the initial fury faded into a heavy, lingering silence that draped over the streets like fog. Years turned into decades, and the specific names of suspects blurred into the background of local folklore. The injustice did not dissipate with time, it hardened. It became a permanent shadow in the history of the region. A century later, the question remains frozen in the air of that town, a testament to a crime that the world refused to solve and that the land refused to forget. The house did not remain empty for long, yet it never truly felt inhabited again. As decades ground forward, the structure began to sag under the weight of its own history. The paint peeled away in long, brittle strips, and the windows became clouded with layers of dust that no one cared to wipe clean.
Locals stopped walking on that side of the street, choosing longer routes to avoid the sight of the porch.
A shift occurred in the town's perspective. The building was no longer just a site of a forgotten tragedy.
It started to exist as a separate, living entity.
The silence inside the rooms grew heavy, thick with a presence that defied the passage of time.
Passers-by reported a sudden drop in temperature when they lingered too near the front gate. The grass grew wild,
choking the pathways, as if the land itself were trying to bury the foundation. The house had become a void,
a magnetic point of concentrated misery that drew the curiosity of the living, while refusing to release the echoes of the dead.
It stood as a permanent scar on the landscape, waiting for the world to notice that the boundary between the past and the present had begun to dissolve. The reputation of the house spread far beyond the borders of Iowa, drawing visitors who sought more than just a glimpse of history. They came looking for a connection to the unexplained. Inside the narrow hallway, the air often carries a sudden, sharp stillness that makes the skin prickle. Visitors stand in the center of the floorboards, holding their breath, waiting for the house to reveal its hidden frequency. It starts as a subtle vibration, a rhythmic sound that mimics the frantic pacing of a panicked child. Then, the sound matures. It manifests as a thin, piercing cry that echoes off the wood-paneled walls, sharp enough to cut through the ambient noise of the street outside. Many who linger in the dark find themselves turning toward the shadows, convinced that a figure is standing just out of sight, watching their every movement. The feeling of being observed is not a fleeting thought. It is a heavy, physical pressure on the back of the neck. When they reach out to touch the walls, the wood feels unnaturally cold, as if the structure itself is pulling heat from the room. These reports are not isolated incidents. They are the recurring, modern echoes of a night that refuses to fade, suggesting that whatever happened in 1912 never truly left the bedrooms. The focus shifted from casual observers to those armed with specialized technology. Ghost hunters moved into the master bedroom, their movements precise and calculated. They set up tripod-mounted cameras in the corners, angling lenses toward the spots where the air seemed to hold the most tension. Digital recorders were placed on the floorboards,
their red lights blinking in the gloom, waiting for any sound to break the oppressive silence.
The investigators adjusted their thermal sensors, scanning the walls for cold spots that defied natural explanation. Then, the first complication hit. A camera battery drained in seconds, despite being fully charged moments earlier. A handheld monitor flickered, displaying only static instead of the room. The investigators crouched, squinting at their screens, trying to filter out the noise.
They moved their equipment closer to the center of the room, tracking a sudden, erratic movement on the infrared feed. The device chimed a sharp,
rhythmic warning, indicating a spike in electromagnetic activity. They did not retreat. Instead, they pressed forward, adjusting their focus, desperate to capture a single flicker of proof. The house remained silent, yet the sensors continued to pulse, recording data that suggested the room was far from empty. Today, the White House sits at the edge of the street, unassuming and quiet. It remains a fixture of the neighborhood, a stark contrast to the modern world that rushes past its port. Thousands of people stand outside the property every year, staring at the siding, searching for an answer that refuses to surface. They look for signs, for cracks in the narrative, or for a whisper of explanation that never comes. The house does not offer resolution. It simply endures. It exists as a silent, unsolved monument to a night that shattered a community and left a permanent scar on the history of the region. The tragedy did not end when the investigation stopped. It settled into the foundation, becoming part of the wood and the dust. Experts and skeptics have come and gone, yet the core of the event remains locked away, untouchable.
Some secrets are never meant to be uncovered, and the house keeps its own counsel. As the sun sets behind the roofline, the windows darken, returning the building to its state of perpetual, heavy silence. The mystery is not a puzzle waiting for a solution.
It is a weight that the town continues to carry, a century later, with no end in sight. The house stands firm, holding the truth in the shadows, waiting for a dawn that will never bring clarity.